On September 3rd, 1988, at the Exchange Bank of Amsterdam on Kalverstraat, a 52-year-old merchant named Peter van der Hoven arrived before the doors opened, just as he had on most mornings for the previous 20 years. By Amsterdam's standards, he was not among the richest citizens. Those at the very top had no reason to appear so early. Yet he lived comfortably and consistently, much like much of Amsterdam's merchant class had done for almost a century. His grandfather earned a living through Baltic grain commerce. His father purchased an interest in a VOCC expedition to the Spice Islands and transformed 1 year of gains into income that lasted a decade. Peter himself spread his investments across several areas: VOCC stock, a loan extended to a Hamburg trader, a modest share in a newly formed insurance venture, and Dutch government bonds. Without realizing it, he embodied the most significant economic transformation of his era. The importance was not in the size of his fortune. It was in what his portfolio represented. His grandfather generated wealth by transporting goods. Peter increasingly generated wealth by holding financial claims connected to those who transported goods. The approach appeared safer. It seemed more advanced. Returns arrived with greater consistency than the unpredictable risks of maritime trade. Across Amsterdam, countless merchants were making the same decision for the same reasons at exactly the same time. Together, those choices became the greatest financial error that would ultimately bring the Dutch Empire to its end. The Dutch Golden Age is often remembered as a story of commerce, openness, and the remarkable success of a small nation that managed to dominate a vast share of global shipping despite occupying less territory than West Virginia. That description is accurate. What receives less attention is the economic foundation beneath that success, and the consequences that followed when that foundation changed. During its peak years, roughly from 1600 through 1670, the Dutch Republic was not mainly a financial economy. It was an economy built on production. The Vloot, a Dutch cargo vessel whose design reduced crew requirements by 40% compared with rival ships, represented a manufacturing breakthrough. It gave Dutch traders a lasting cost advantage over foreign competitors. The herring industry, the textile finishing sector in Leiden, and the windmill-powered sawmills, paper mills, and paint mills surrounding Amsterdam all contributed to an economy that produced tangible goods more efficiently than any other known region of the world. Established in 1609, the Amsterdam Exchange Bank existed to support that productive system. It supplied dependable currency and a trustworthy clearing process that turned Amsterdam into the central point of European commerce. Confidence in the guilder came from its backing by real metal. That metal filled the vaults because trade itself was genuine and substantial. Grain arrived from the Baltic, spices came from the Indies, cloth flowed from textile centers, timber arrived from Norway. Although the VOCC later became known for financial innovation, its earliest investors expected profits from actual commercial voyages. The shares issued in the 1600s represented claims on future earnings generated by purchasing pepper in Batavia and selling it in Amsterdam. At its core, the enterprise was physical business. Ships had to be loaded, oceans had to be crossed, suppliers had to be negotiated with, buyers had to be found. This productive system was what the Dutch created. It was also what they eventually left behind. The transition started during the 1670s and gained momentum throughout the early 18th century. It was not the result of one dramatic decision. Instead, it emerged from many separate choices that appeared sensible on their own. Collectively, however, those choices redirected the Dutch economy away from production and toward finance. In doing so, they weakened the very source that had originally made Dutch finance valuable. The process itself was simple. Through 2 generations of highly productive trade, Dutch merchants accumulated immense amounts of capital. That capital now required a return. By the closing decades of the 17th century, a different investment opportunity emerged. It promised dependable income without the challenges of operating ships or overseeing trading stations across distant regions. That opportunity was government debt. England required funds to wage war against Louis XIV. Then it required additional funds. Then more again. The English financial transformation of the 1690s created a system where Dutch capital could generate stable returns through lending to the English crown. Most of the financial tools involved had already been pioneered by the Dutch themselves. As a result, Dutch investors naturally became major participants. By 1720, Dutch investors were estimated to own 25% of all English national debt. By 1760, some calculations suggested Dutch ownership of English government securities had reached 1/3 of the entire total. Capital was steadily leaving Amsterdam and moving toward London. It was not being directed into English factories or industrial expansion. Instead, it was being lent to the English state at fixed and guaranteed rates. The Dutch were not acting irrationally. English government bonds were legitimately attractive assets. The income they generated was real. The perceived danger was limited. When compared with a VOCC expedition, where a typhoon or military conflict could wipe out an entire investment, A 4% perpetual annuity issued by the English crown appeared to represent financial sophistication. This is where the crucial development occurred. Every guilder committed to English government debt was a guilder that never reached Dutch industry. In Leiden, the Dutch textile sector was steadily losing ground to English rivals. At the same time, the herring industry was shrinking. Shipyards were receiving fewer contracts as English and Swedish competitors secured more business. The industrial foundation that had elevated Amsterdam into the world's leading financial center was gradually weakening. Meanwhile, the profits generated from lending money to those very competitors continued to appear strong on paper. That was the central error. Not any individual investment, since each could be justified on its own merits. The mistake was the broader transition from an economy that created wealth through production into one focused on administering accumulated wealth. In the process, Dutch capital helped finance the productive expansion of competitors, who would eventually replace Dutch commercial leadership altogether. The 18th century unfolded almost exactly as this process would suggest. Amsterdam remained prosperous. Dutch institutions continued to display remarkable sophistication. The exchange bank stayed operational. Dutch investors kept receiving income from foreign bond portfolios. Loans extended to European monarchs, insurance ventures, and financial intermediary activities. Viewed from the perspective of balance sheets and financial accounts, the Dutch economy in 1750 appeared completely sound. What those records failed to show was the productive capacity that had disappeared. Dutch shipping, once dominant throughout European trade, had been overtaken by English and French fleets, financed in part through capital supplied by Dutch lenders. The industrial communities that once produced the goods exchanged through Amsterdam had entered a prolonged decline. Beneath the impressive financial structure, the real economy had been gradually hollowed out through a long series of comfortable investment decisions. The political consequences became visible during the 1780s. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, fought from 1780 to 1784, revealed with devastating clarity the difference between Dutch financial wealth and Dutch national power. The English Navy, supported in part by capital Dutch investors, had lent to the English crown, devastated Dutch commercial shipping on a scale that stunned contemporary observers. The Dutch had effectively funded the forces that displaced them. In 1795, armies of the French Revolution entered the Dutch Republic and encountered almost no military resistance. The nation that had been Europe's wealthiest power for 150 years ultimately gave up its independence to France with little meaningful resistance. The reason was not a sudden collapse. Over the previous century, the productive strength and military capability needed for a serious defense had gradually been redirected toward financial returns. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank had supported the guilder with metal reserves for 186 years. Then a quiet reality emerged. The institution no longer possessed sufficient reserves. Much of its metal had been loaned to the VOC and to the city of Amsterdam against assets that could not be recovered quickly. In 1790, the bank was dissolved. The guilder lost its position as the world's reserve currency. That role moved to the pound sterling, which retained the status for another century before it eventually passed to the dollar. This history remains important because it illustrates a broader economic pattern. Economists have a name for the Dutch error. It is known as the transition from a productive economy to a rentier economy. In simple terms, it means moving from generating wealth through creation and production to generating wealth through ownership of claims on those who produce. Such a shift can create strong financial performance over the medium term. Over longer periods, however, productive capacity can weaken because financial returns increasingly attract capital that might otherwise support production. For approximately the last 4 decades, major Western economies have experienced some version of this transition. In the United States, the financial sector expanded from roughly 4% of GDP in 1950 to roughly 8% today. During the same period, manufacturing declined from 28% to 11%. In Britain, finance became a dominant force within the economy, a trend that has been linked to the relative decline of manufacturing strength since at least the 1970s. Germany represents a partial exception. A significant portion of Germany's economic resilience comes from preserving industrial productive capacity. That was the very foundation the Dutch left behind. It is also the foundation many others have gradually reduced since then. The Dutch investors of 1700 were not acting irrationally when judged by immediate financial outcomes. Their decisions made sense individually. Yet those same choices, when repeated across an entire economy, produced consequences that none of them had intentionally selected. The productive system that supported their financial prosperity was gradually displaced. For every heavily financialized economy, the central question remains unchanged. At what moment does finance cease serving production and begin replacing it? The Dutch crossed that threshold sometime during the early 18th century. Financial prosperity continued for another generation. The loss of productive strength endured far longer. Consider Peter van der Hoven standing outside the Exchange Bank on September 3rd, 1688. By the standards available to him, he was not making a mistake. His grandfather accepted significant risks and was rewarded. His father accepted smaller risks and achieved more dependable gains. Peter embraced even lower risks through financial instruments that offered the greatest predictability. Each generation became more advanced in financial terms. At the same time, each generation became less connected to production. For nearly a century, financial sophistication moved upward while productive activity moved in the opposite direction. Eventually, the productive foundation disappeared. What remained was financial sophistication with nothing substantial beneath it. For 200 years, the Dutch Empire ranked among the richest powers on earth. The financial decision that contributed to its decline was not fraud. It was not speculation. It was not a reckless wager. It was a collective and largely invisible preference for financial returns over productive investment, repeated again and again until productive opportunities had largely vanished. If you found this historical account valuable, share your thoughts and continue the discussion. Your perspective helps expand the conversation and deepen the understanding of how economic choices shape long-term outcomes.